Thanks, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. So we're going to kick off the afternoon sessions with a discussion on ensuring public-private alignment for effective cyber policy. This panel will be moderated by my colleague, Karolos Karnikis. He is our Senior Vice President of Technology at the National Bureau of Asian Research, where he is responsible for MBR's information security and technology infrastructure, and he is a certified information systems security professional. He's been with MBR for well over 20 years and is really quite an expert on these issues, so looking forward to this discussion.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon for our third panel. And again, I'll just say the title of it again. I think it's important for us to all keep it in mind, ensuring public-private alignment for effective cyber policy. And I'm going to introduce, I have the pleasure of introducing our distinguished members of our panel. To my right here, Jake Bernstein. Jake is a partner at K&L Gates Seattle office and a member of their technology transactions and sourcing and data protection, privacy, and security practice groups. He is also a certified information systems security professional, and he co-hosts a cyber risk management podcast. Prior to joining K&L Gates, he served as Assistant Attorney General in the Consumer Protection Division of the Washington State Office of the Attorney General. He received his JD from Seattle University School of Law, where he's also an adjunct professor. Next to Jake is Andrew Grotto. Andrew is a research scholar at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University and a senior fellow for cybersecurity policy at NBR. Prior to his role at Stanford, he served as senior director for cybersecurity policy at the White House during the Obama and Trump administrations. And before that, he worked on Capitol Hill for several years. His research interests center on national security and the economic dimensions of America's global leadership in information technology innovation. He received his JD from the University of California, Berkeley, and his MA from Harvard University. And then next to Andy is Rob Spiger. Rob is Director for Cybersecurity Policy at Microsoft, where he leads global efforts to advance cyber resilience, security by design, and regulatory harmonization. For over 2 decades at Microsoft, Rob has deep expertise in cybersecurity, industry standards and regulation, and trusted computing technology. Prior to joining Microsoft in 2003, he held positions at Avanade, Advanced Technical Resources, and Lockheed Martin. He's also participated for over a decade in the Trusted Computing Group, a global standards organization. He has degrees in computer science and electrical engineering from the University of Washington. And so we'll start by giving each of our panelists a few minutes to make some opening remarks, and we'll start with Jake.
Start with me?
Yeah.
All right. So my primary contribution to this was to discuss how we see kind of one of the less direct public-private partnerships in cybersecurity, and that is through regulations, enforcement actions, and then government sponsored or provided resources that you get out of organizations and agencies like NIST and CISA. So the U.S. doesn't have a nationwide GDPR-style privacy law. I think we all know that. It does, however, have 50 different state data breach notification laws, and it has a handful of sectoral regulations, famously HIPAA and the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which apply to healthcare industry and financial industry, respectively. And then for the defense industry, there is the DFARS regulations for acquisition by the federal government, which also impose a great deal of requirements on cybersecurity related issues. So I think you can start with that as, is it a partnership? No, but it is it's a required partnership. You have to comply with these things if you want to do business. You have to comply with them in order to avoid enforcement actions. And I think it's a really critical component of cybersecurity policy, not just obviously in the United States, but every country. And then in terms of the I guess you could call it, if that was the stick, then the carrot side is NIST and CISA with all of their free resources. These are attempts to provide the private sector, specifically critical infrastructure, but also really anybody, with materials and frameworks, policies, white papers, just everything that you might need in order to stand up a reasonable cybersecurity program. And I think those resources are easy to forget, but tremendously valuable and an important component of the enforcement side, because you can, if you align yourself to NIST cybersecurity framework, for example, then presumably the regulators will look more kindly upon you if you suffer a breach, which will happen anyway. So, go ahead.
Right. Well, thanks everyone. It's always daunting to go after lunch, so I hope you all are salaried and have your energy levels high. So I want to describe a shift underway in the Asia Pacific region to include the United States, in starting with cyber doctrine. But then we're beginning to see this manifested in shifts in law and in institutions as well. And that's a shift from a sort of a fortress model of cyber defense to a more active, forward deployed model. Some refer to it as active defense. Some call it proactive defense. However you want to describe it. It's this idea that organizations, whether it's critical infrastructure, whether it's government agencies, defending their own systems, can no longer sit behind a would-be literal or virtual firewall of defense. They need to go out and actively disrupt or attempt to disrupt cyber threat adversaries wherever they may be globally. The shift, I think you could sort of mark it, start in U.S. doctrine in 2018. With especially in U.S. Department of Defense strategy materials, referring to notions like defend forward, persistent engagement. Again, the idea that the government needs to go out and meet threat actors outside of, in this case, the Department of Defense's systems, not wait for adversaries to get to the perimeter before trying to disrupt their operations. But we've seen other shifts. We've seen shifts in doctrine throughout the Asia Pacific region. Korea in 2024 refers to offensive actions, and we can come back to what we mean by offensive actions, because that's part of the I think the twist here. The Japanese last year, many of you may know, enacted an active cyber defense law, along with a pretty significant reorganization of the Japanese government, designed to again be more expeditionary in its deployments. Singapore has talked about proactive cyber defense. It last July attributed an attack indirectly to China, which is a pretty big deal for the Singaporeans. They didn't name China per se, but if you read David Koh's speech, you know exactly who he's talking about. And there's plans to establish a defense cyber command in Singapore. Just a few examples. Thailand, another interesting example. Thailand's been talking about offensive cyber operations for years now, quietly but publicly. And I think, so far, most of the changes I think we've seen in doctrine. There are some countries that have enacted changes in law to the extent that law was a barrier to carrying out more disruptive operations. So Japan is perhaps the best example. And then, of course, it requires institutions, capabilities to go out and execute active defense-like operations. And that's where I think we see the least maturity across the region. The U.S. I think is kind of has hit some milestones over the last 4 or 5 years in its capabilities. Japan is in the process of setting up this institutional infrastructure internally. And it's an open question whether and to what extent other countries of the region will follow suit with their own capabilities in addition to these doctrinal changes. Why don't I stop there, and looking forward to further discussions.
That's a very interesting handoff to me. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like over the last 5 years or so, there's been a lot more government interest in the importance of cybersecurity and how it impacts its economy as well as its social well-being. And I think we've seen a global shift to understanding that essential providers' use of technology is important for governments to understand clearly and monitor. And so we've seen a proliferation of interest in information sharing to governments from essential operators within different countries, as well as technology providers. And then also a greater concern about the cybersecurity of products and services that are in use within their region. And I think, there's quite a bit of activity around the world kind of focused on governments understanding better how security incidents in cyberspace are impacting critical infrastructure within their region. And I think there's also an evolution of, how do they understand what's going on and get better transparency? And so we've seen a proliferation of incident reporting requirements. And, I think it's important to call out the different types of information sharing. One is reporting incidents, which companies are now starting to be required to do. Another is, from our perspective, that's best when it's an incident that's actually happened as opposed to an incident that could happen or a near miss, just because we know critical infrastructure and technology providers are under constant threat from malicious actors. And then there is the important point that the entity that knows the useful information to share about an incident is the right one to report it. We might know that a customer has suffered an incident due to cloud infrastructure failure, but we don't know what the impact of that is based on how they're using that cloud infrastructure. They could have redundancy across different providers and have no impact. So we think it's appropriate to think about the right entity to do the reporting so the government really understands what the impact of a cybersecurity incident could have been or is. And then the other thing is vulnerability reporting, which is sort of propped up around different regions. China has a network information security reporting requirement. The EU has proposed or has adopted the EU Cyber Resilience Act, which also has a requirement to report actively exploited vulnerabilities. And I think that the important thing from our perspective there is it's important not to disseminate information about vulnerabilities before mitigations are available. And that's kind of been one of the core principles we've tried to focus on around information sharing related to vulnerabilities. Once a vulnerability has been made public, or if there are mitigations available for it, especially security updates, that's an easier time to disseminate that information more widely. At the same time, you've got governments that want to take information about vulnerabilities and kind of share them in real time with critical infrastructure operators to better protect them. But I think it's important to look at the overall picture of what's the risk of disseminating unmitigated vulnerability information versus the critical infrastructure operator's ability to actually do anything about it without some solution from the manufacturer to patch it. And then the last category of information sharing is cyber threat intelligence. And I think it's important to remember there that companies sort of need to be incentivized to invest in that. Some companies need to do it just as a matter of business. For example, we track numerous threat actors around the world just so we understand what they're up to and how to better protect our customers. But a lot of companies have an entire business model around generating threat intelligence. And if governments just mandate that that is shared, that may disrupt their business model and the threat intelligence may evaporate. So kind of thinking about those 3 different buckets for information sharing, especially from the critical infrastructure side, is important for governments to keep in mind. And then the other area governments are really advancing things is in imposing cybersecurity requirements for products, whether that's a mandatory thing or a voluntary thing if you want to access a certain market, or things where it's mandatory, like in the EU across the whole market for many of the regulations they've been passing. And I think that's really an area where there's active experimentation going on about how do you define the right level of what a manufacturer is supposed to do before they introduce a product. What are they expected to do during the support time period for it? And how to clarify those things so the huge ecosystem of software and service providers can understand what they're supposed to do and act on it in a way that's clear. And I think most recently we've been seeing in the EU sort of an expectation, and also in the US, that manufacturers will sort of collect information and then regulators can come and ask to look at it when they want to see it, both for product security as well as things like doing risk mitigation. So, I think we're seeing the importance of cybersecurity strategies develop in countries around the Asia region, as well as an interest in how to regulate products better and what type of information sharing with the government will give them more transparency into how critical infrastructure is operated, especially its technology independence. So hopefully that just sets the stage a little bit from our perspective about like what's going on the cyber policy side for governments.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Well, what I'm going to do, I have a few questions to start off our discussion here, and then we can open it up to the audience for questions. But to begin the discussion, I thought we could. Earlier this month, the Trump administration published its national cybersecurity strategy, and there's a lot to unpack in this short document. And I thought we could take a few moments to talk about what this document means, or have our panel speak to that. We thought that we could start with Andy. Have you speak to some of your key takeaways, what it means for in terms of the public-private piece, and that I think it's very prominent in all pillars across the document, but then also for how the U.S. engages with its partners, the implications, and then also potentially with threat actors. So maybe you could help us kick off the discussion on giving us your reflections on that.
Yeah, a few points. If you've had a chance to look at it, it's very short. And I have a lot of sympathy for the amount of effort that goes into crafting a document like this. So I don't mean this as a critique along those lines. But 7 pages is not a strategy; it's a brochure. And one of the challenges that I see in the document is that there's just an awful lot that the document leaves to the reader's imagination, especially when it comes to questions around trade-offs, questions around implementation. And so, as one example, in the months leading up to the report's launch, there was a lot of news reporting on this theme of active defense again that I referred to in my opening remarks. That the Trump administration wanted to enlist the U.S. private sector in more efforts to sort of, again, kind of take the disruptive kind of defensive activities outside of the defender's own networks and be more expeditionary. And the report has some language along those lines, but doesn't really elaborate very much. And so I think what ends up happening is people read the document and they sort of project. It becomes like a Rorschach test, right? If you're in the camp of people who think that the Trump administration is inclined to do the right thing when it comes to cyber policy, then you will project your vision of what that might look like and how the government might responsibly engage the private sector. If you don't have that view, right, you're gonna project the opposite assumptions, and so it just leaves a lot to imagination. I think that to me is a real challenge. I think that the administration is likely to face moving forward as it tries to kind of breathe life into the strategy. The strategy is striking. So I could say a lot more about the strategy. I'll add one more point, which is, the strategy is striking in its discussion of regulatory policy. When the Trump administration came into office, there's this big deregulatory push, and across multiple sectors. If you look at the strategy, you see a lot of talk about regulatory alignment, regulatory harmonization. In some cases reducing duplicative regulations, but it doesn't scream deregulation. And I think that's really interesting and a thread that I would love to pull more. And again, but because the strategy is so short, it's hard to know how much to make of that, right? So yeah, I'll end there.
I mean, I think the active defense piece is a very interesting part of the strategy. I think, as was mentioned earlier about sovereignty, there are a lot of different definitions of what active defense means. If it means working with law enforcement and taking down botnets by seizing domains that are doing malicious activities to protect customers, that's active. It's also defense. If you're focused on the part that's offensive, or working with the government, for example, to modify products or put backdoors in, that's an activity Microsoft doesn't do. We don't put backdoors in our products. I think the other piece to it, though, is even though it may be very tempting to focus on the offensive piece of the strategy, it's critically important to make sure that what you're doing in your enterprise or organization is secure as possible. Because whether there's offense or not, we're going to continue to have cybersecurity attacks and malicious actors will be out there. So offense isn't the solution to solve everything. You still need to do your homework and put up your defenses within your organization. And I think that's just so critically important to emphasize.
Jake, did you have any comments on the strategy or especially on the regulation piece of it?
Well, I mean, there's two comments I want to make. One is the regulatory piece is like 4 sentences. Mm-hmm. We will do a lot of awesome things is effectively what it says, which is not particularly helpful. I think the piece that is I'll just say interesting is what is really a threat at the very, very beginning of moving forward. The sentence says, we will not confine our responses to the, quote, cyber realm. It's hard to read that and not think, okay, so we're going to engage in additional, I guess, non-cyber space activities in the pursuit of cybersecurity. It's very ambiguous. And that's all I have to say about that.
Let me add a point. I think this comes back to this the language is written in a way that invites the reader to kind of project by necessity their own sort of assumptions and background assumptions about what the language means. And I think it's interesting, like this idea that the U.S. would respond to cyber incidents in a manner and a time of its own choosing. It has deep roots in U.S. defense doctrine. But when it's one sentence in a pretty short document, it does stand out more. Again, it's hard to know what that means. Does the administration have a particular example in mind? Are there red lines that have been developed, in the interagency process to develop a strategy that color, that language? Not clear. There may be good reasons for the government not to necessarily publish those red lines either. But the brevity of the document just invites an awful lot it requires a lot of assumptions on the part of the reader, which I think is risky.
I think from our perspective as Microsoft, we often look at activities in cyberspace through the lens of what should cybersecurity norms be in cyberspace, and not attacking things like hospitals or critical infrastructure that's going to cause widespread issues for societies is critically important. And I think maybe applying those expected norms of cyber behavior in cyberspace to kind of when something might need a larger response from a government is beneficial to do. And those kind of need to be built up with attribution for what types of attacks have been happening, and also kind of a decision about whether is this within the norm of behavior in cyberspace during peacetime, or is this outside that norm, and maybe the government, may do other actions like sanctions or economic things to try to deter activities, or have other governments cooperate more fully in taking down cyber criminals that operate from within their jurisdiction.
Just add, I think it's safe to say that you'd be hard pressed to find any government, not just within the Asia Pacific region, but arguably globally, who's satisfied with the level of cyber resilience that exists within their economies. I think you'd be hard pressed to find, this maybe slims down the number of countries, but certainly among the countries that I mentioned in my introduction, countries that feel that this sort of fortress defensive model is enough. I think that is a shrinking number of countries, and given the relative lack of maturity across jurisdictions, and okay, what does active to cyber defense mean? To Rob's point, I think we're going to see a lot of hopefully healthy and productive debate about this concept over the next couple of years. I'm particularly interested in seeing how this debate unfolds within Japan, which has really leaned into this concept, legislatively, and again is building institutional capabilities. But again, we're still kind of, the shift has happened, right, away from this fortress mentality, but it's still not yet clear what direction it's going to go, and where things like offensive cyber operations, right, attacking a computer, right, where those kinds of operations fit in. And many countries may well define active defense as not including those kinds of activities. Considering activities like making strong attribution claims, for example, threat intelligence sharing, botnet takedowns of the kind that that Microsoft has worked very collaboratively with the U.S. government on for many years now to great effect. So time will tell.
When you look at some of the what's happening in Japan, what kind of opportunities might that open up if you could play that forward to collaboration with the United States? What kind of opportunities might exist for greater collaboration with the U.S. With changes that are occurring in Japan? I'm just trying to think through some positive partnership scenarios.
Yeah, so there are a few benefits to persistent engagement. This idea that as a defender, you're going to go out and meet the attackers on their own infrastructure, and understand that when I talk about infrastructure, your typical cyber adversary is not sitting at home in their home jurisdiction on their home machine carrying out attacks. They compromise infrastructure around the world to carry out their attacks. So we're talking about operations that are taking place in third countries, which may or may not correspond with the location of the threat actor. Those kinds of operations yield, in addition to hopefully imposing costs on the adversary, right? Making them have to reconstitute their infrastructure, be more careful, right? All of that can help contribute to deterrence, but you also learn a lot. Right, so there's, I think, huge potential value for information sharing, intelligence sharing between the U.S. and Japan. Should the Japanese really move forward to develop this model. Japanese government is also not been as forthcoming with details yet. Products, I don't think they know exactly where they want to take this. I could be wrong, but so. We'll learn more about what this move to active cyber defense in Japan looks like probably the next year or so. But yeah, I think there's huge potential value in the bilateral relationship.
One of the pillars discusses the need for addressing some of the critical infrastructure in this country. And it's obviously for every country, this is a big concern, and every country has a different configuration, state-owned versus private and so forth. And even if maybe some of the plan, the strategy we've been discussing is maybe light on details here, what is the current state in this country, and then maybe looking at some of the other countries across the region? What are the key vulnerabilities? What do because really, if we're talking about, even if we're talking about I mean, that critical infrastructure, really, we could talk about data centers, we can talk about all kinds of different, corporations and so forth. But they do rely on that. At the end of the day, they do rely on that critical infrastructure as well. So let's take a minute and talk a little bit about the state of that critical infrastructure, their vulnerabilities, and just have a little discussion around that piece. I don't know who would like to start first.
I mean, I can start. I think, a critical vulnerability is using software or products that are beyond their end of life without doing mitigating controls to compensate for that. I think, there's a recent publication from CISA around trying to get rid of devices that are out of support and encouraging critical infrastructure and the US government to remove those from service. That's an area where, I guess making especially smaller providers of critical infrastructure aware of cybersecurity risks, getting them to take up cybersecurity capacity building and training, as well as be able to apply those things by having the resources or funds to be able to have better cybersecurity approaches would be great. I would love it if active defense also included threat exercises and simulations of cyber incidents. I think that's a possibility for governments to collaborate on as well, and very helpful for their critical infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think this is a spot where true regulation and requirements are probably absolutely critical, because, think about how you would get an organization, particularly critical infrastructure, to be secure. You can't just write a law that says it's illegal to be hacked. Okay. It is illegal to be hacked, or it's illegal to do the hacking. What's the penalty if I get hacked? How do I know if I got hacked because I was out of compliance or because they were just really good at hacking? And there's really, there's not been a good answer for this since real cybersecurity became a widespread, something to be aware of. And I think some of the things we see, like the CIRCIA, I can never remember the full acronym, critical infrastructure, or something about the Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. It's something like that, but I can never remember the whole thing. But it does a couple of things, right? It does require, obviously, reporting of infrastructure, or of incidents to critical infrastructure. There's also aspects of it that require at least a little bit of process. And cybersecurity is a challenging thing to legislate, because, well, what even is cybersecurity, right? Is it is it a destination? Is it a state? Is it an end state? Is it a journey? I used to say, cybersecurity isn't where you're going, it's how you get there. And but it also never ends. So you try to get an alignment, and I get clients coming to me saying, "Oh, it's so expensive. What's going to happen if I don't do it?" So these questions are all inextricable from an alignment perspective. I don't have them. There's no answer for it. I think you can legislate requirements for, annual tabletops, for, having incident response plans and practicing them, all of that stuff. But it really, that's just legislating process. It doesn't directly get to cybersecurity. And I think that's a big challenge when you're trying to come up with policy, because you can have, I mean, I'm reading this ridiculous 7-page thing, and I say it's ridiculous not because I necessarily like, you can't disagree with it. Like, nothing in it is where you're like, oh, we shouldn't do that. No, it's actually the opposite. Every single sentence is like, yeah, that sounds good. We should do that. And the problem is that it's kind of a series of, well, obviously statements where, yeah, we should do all of those things, but how? And it doesn't go there at all.
Well, and very often there's it's one thing to say you have to do this, but then, yeah, there's a resource issue, especially in this country for critical infrastructure, because you have smaller companies doing these services. They literally don't have the resources to implement. They even know about all these problems now, but how are they going to implement how are they going to comply? They don't have the resources to comply. So that's a big piece of it. And maybe, I think maybe Andy, you know the answer. There is, I think, some more legislation planned or coming around this, maybe, or we don't. Do you know?
Yeah, there's a lot of activity at the state level. But it's really hard to get anything out of Congress, right? Especially something involving what would amount to regulatory policy. Even if you'll find, broad bipartisan agreement that critical infrastructure is not resilient enough at the moment. The challenge is that the diagnosis of why is it varies, right? So one diagnosis of why as well. The problem is not one of incentives. It's a problem of information and coordination, right? So if critical infrastructure, and we use, there are 16 sectors, so it makes it hard to generalize, but I'll use the phrase critical infrastructure advisedly. Critical infrastructure are the shortcomings because they don't necessarily have the best threat information, because they can't necessarily link, cause and effect in terms of, linking an investment and security to a better risk outcome. Is it a coordination problem where, maybe if the government were to step in and develop frameworks that allow these organizations and their business partners to collaborate better, and this framework is an example, maybe that's the solution. In those cases, right, we're not talking about externalities, or we're not talking about problems that the organization doesn't have an incentive to fix. It's just they don't know how. There's another diagnosis of the problem, which has to do with incentives, and that is the harder one. And it's, frankly, it's my own view of most sectors, is that there's a gap between what an organization can live with from a risk perspective, from their individual standpoint as an enterprise, whether it be critical infrastructure or not, and some higher level of resilience that either as a matter of public policy, a national security nerd like me would prefer, or because there are third parties who are affected by their risk decisions that have no say in whether that entity tries to reduce risk. Make it more concrete, that latter example, that's the third party example. Think data breach problems, right? If a credit rating agency, if a credit rating organization suffers a breach of consumer data, right? That's an externality, right? Those customers that they're bearing the cost of that organization's risk decisions, they have no say in whether that organization does better the next time, because where they get, they're not the customers, they're not paying for the service, which is their data that was collected. So if we're talking about problems like that, there, I think you need a much more substantive regulatory intervention, but then you get into the measurement problems, which I think are severe and depressing. I've been telling my students this now for 7 years, and I'm embarrassed to say it every time, and I'm embarrassed to admit it to you today now. But those of us in the cybersecurity world, there is no empirical study that I'm aware of that can credibly make a causal connection between investment in particular security controls and superior risk resilience outcomes. That is really depressing. Now, there are reasons for this. It's a really hard measurement problem. It's hard to get data. Causation is difficult to establish. But yeah, it's not a very encouraging state of affairs.
Maybe we should open it up here for questions to the audience here. We have about 15 minutes left or so. Any questions? Okay, in the back there, yep.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm Renalini. I work for the Indian Consulate, and this was all super helpful. So what I'm essentially wondering is, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, and especially India, there's growing emphasis on data sovereignty or supply chains, and this is relevant to what we were talking about in terms of critical infrastructure. So if you had to recommend, or if we're looking at the trade-offs, should governments then focus on a single global cyber framework, which is what feels intuitive in this conversation and otherwise, or who does it serve better to then have those regional systems that are distinct to these regions, and maybe that serves us better? So how do we think about the trade-offs in terms of what we're talking about?
I mean, I guess I'll just start by saying I don't think that cybersecurity. So you can obviously have very different regional approaches to regulating or requiring cybersecurity in certain ways, but I don't think good cybersecurity is a regional. It doesn't have a regional component, right? Like, good cybersecurity here is good cybersecurity in Europe is good cybersecurity anywhere, for the most part. And maybe that's a simplification, but I think that I'm not sure that I would recommend standardizing on any particular framework, just because the bad guys will then find the holes in that framework. So I mean, it is, I'm depressed now. It is a depressing problem, given how difficult. I mean, if you can't measure it, it's difficult to know what is good or bad, and therefore what you say or what to even regulate. I was thinking when Andy was talking that, if we tossed all the executives of a utility in jail for a year if they got hacked, we'd probably see very few, cyber incidents that take the grid down. Short of doing that, which maybe not a bad idea. I don't know, but I don't think that there are major regional differences in what constitutes good cybersecurity.
I'll add. I think this measurement problem means that most countries are likely to have their own sort of sense of what level of risk is or isn't appropriate to accept. I do think there's a lot of room for harmonization, especially around standards, with the more modest aim of allowing critical infrastructure, enterprises, software and hardware suppliers to sort of speak a common language about requirements. And in some cases, communicate more effectively with either their regulators or regulators in other jurisdictions where they do business. So whether that's ISO standards, other efforts like that, I think have and do carry a lot of value. But I would argue a lot of the value lay in, I think, someone asked a question earlier in the day about, contracts and sort of public law. I think that's primarily a value in the public law side, the way that the companies negotiate cybersecurity requirements among themselves.
I think international standards are a good vehicle to share best practices, but I also think there's an ability for innovation to happen in different regions. And I think it's really important to follow up that innovation with pushing best practices back into those international standards and participating in them. I think it's also helpful too when governments make publications that provide guidance about how to improve cybersecurity posture. CISA does a lot of that. The NIST standards are a good example of that. I think those really come out as the best publications when they do have collaboration with industry to develop them, just because then they can be based on real world experiences industries having, or close collaboration with critical infrastructure operators. And so, I would say it's important for innovation to happen in different places. It's just helpful to come back when things are successful and share those around the rest of the world.
Great. Any other questions? Yep. About over here.
And then one back there too.
Okay.
This is hopefully a non-depressing question in the subject. So if you started again, I mean, you're professionals, you're patching what we have. If you are allowed to start again, rewrite the rules, go right down to the fundamental hardware. Is there a plan? Is there a thought process there? Because patching things, we can continuously patch stuff, and there'll be continuously people trying to break the patches, right? So, I mean, is there a branch of cyber policy and cybersecurity which basically goes, okay, we patching here, but here's more of a utopian vision of where we can go. And, we started with a network which had anonymity in it, which immediately gave a problem to any cyber security system, because someone could be anonymous in the system. But if you started again today, would you have what we have today? It's more of an optimistic question rather than.
No, it's still depressing. And the reason is that I mean, ARPANET, which was the precursor of the internet, was designed for one thing, which was to survive nuclear attack, right? The goal of ARPANET was not to do commerce. It was not to send emails. It was to have enough redundancy in the network that if cities got taken out, that the network could route around those radioactive holes. That's what it was designed for. And it did that just fine, fortunately. We never needed that particular capability. But then we built on it and built on it and built on it. And I'd say it's far beyond just patching it. It's the fundamental design of the internet as we have it today had nothing to do with security or identity or authentication or any of these concepts that matter now. So yes, if we started over, we would have a very different design. What that design looks like, you could have a room full of computer scientists and security experts debate for months and still come up with nothing concrete. From a cyber policy perspective, the counterfactual is fun but not helpful, because we have the internet we have, and I think that there are some things that are done. I mean, you have air-gapped networks. You don't connect to the internet is an option. All these types of things. I don't want to take over the whole table, but
I have actually worked on hardware security standards with the intent of having some safe place to store secrets on computers, and I think it has been successful around. There's a lot greater proliferation of hardware security capabilities on platforms people purchase today, as well as new approaches to how to provide hardware-based security. Hardware also has security flaws too, but just the prevalence of technologies that are easier to use, like the trusted platform module used to be basically undeployable as a security feature in Windows, and now people buy platforms with it all the time and never know it's there, but still have better protection. And so I think it's part of its usability and getting better at how to provide security features. There's also advantages like memory safe languages that are getting greater adoption. A lot of the vulnerabilities are tied to memory issues, and so using a memory safe language can help mitigate that. I think part of the challenge though is there's a gargantuan install base of code that's not in memory safe languages. And I think, that there is a promising avenue, though, of using AI for security and applying it for defenders and also improving engineering processes. And so I think, we're just at the cusp of that, and that's very exciting from my perspective. I don't think we could have gone back and started with AI, but it may be very helpful as a way to augment the security practices companies are doing, or to help improve capacity of people to do cybersecurity activities that are important for their organization.
don't you think it'll eventually just come down to AI versus AI? I mean, it will.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of debate, right, about sort of the offense-defense balance and whether and how AI will affect it. And my own 2 cents is I think it's a battle of it's sort of dueling J curves. J curve is the typical curve that a general purpose technology takes when it's making its way into an economy. There's sort of a dip below break even on return on investment. So in other words, there's a period of time typically where investments in a new general purpose technology lead to losses because those investments are in intangible assets, new business processes, training, knowledge that don't appear on a balance sheet. And then as those intangible investments begin to translate into real, sort of productivity gains, that's when you start to really then see the J curve lift. And I think if you think about this from the standpoint of attackers versus defenders, the attackers are going to be able to make money faster, right, using AI. And I think that means they're going to flatten the J curve of AI diffusion quicker than defenders will. Now, over the long term, maybe some of the advantages that defenders will have in terms of being able to rely on enterprise products that are built on massive data sets that maybe the attackers don't have access to, maybe that begins to shift the balance. I'm a little more optimistic on that front, but I think short to medium term, I think AI is going to sadly cook a lot of companies and a lot of businesses from a cybersecurity perspective.
Hey, we have Nelson in the back there.
I'm Nelson Dong, a member of the NBR Board of Advisors. Given that Iran and Israel are two of the most notorious countries in the world with regard to cybercrime and cyber operations, are there any lessons from the current Iran war that would affect U.S. policy, such as the Stryker attack that happened to the medical device company?
Yeah, you take that one.
Yeah. No, I think there are, and with the caveat that it's still early days, and we can even go back a little further and look at the full-scale Russia-Ukraine conflict, where one set of lessons has to do with the utility of offensive cyber operations. I think that both the Russia-Ukraine conflict and I suspect that the current conflict with Iran will show that offensive cyber operations had the most value at the beginning of conflict in terms of being able to achieve military objectives, because once the conflict was underway, the pace of kinetic operations is simply too fast for offensive cyber operations to keep up with and contribute to mission outcomes. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't still benefits to offensive cyber operations during the conflict. They're different, and they have more to do with degrading the adversary's ability and willingness to fight, right? So persistently attacking. In Ukraine's case, the Russians have kept government systems under a lot of pressure, critical infrastructure systems under a lot of pressure. Those attacks don't always necessarily cause long-term outages, but they have this cumulative effect over time in the Russian mindset. I think one of the interesting questions to ask about the Iran-U.S.-Israeli conflict now is, why haven't we seen attacks on critical infrastructure here in the United States? The Iranians are pretty good. They're very capable threat actors. They've demonstrated an ability and a willingness in the past to compromise critical infrastructure, including water infrastructure. And, there hasn't been to the best of our knowledge, a successful Iranian cyber attack against U.S. critical infrastructure linked to this conflict yet. Could change. Why might that be the case? Again, we'll learn more as time goes on. But there's a countrywide internet blackout in Iran, right? That I have to imagine has some impact on Iranian threat actors' ability to carry out and coordinate operations. I also think that since the U.S. knew it was going to attack, it might have taken action to shore up critical infrastructure through targeted engagements, through disruptive operations, sort of defend forward operations against known Iranian cyber infrastructure before the conflict started, to preempt those attacks. But for now, we don't really know.
Maybe one more question there. Go ahead.
Hopefully trying to end this on a positive note, but what's the path to progress for US Asia Pacific cyber cooperation? obviously multiple countries, including the US, are adjusting domestic laws and regulation, active cyber defense and such, but there's obviously still a lot of work to do to address and build up more fundamental capacities in the region. What does a effective US cybersecurity sort of engagement plan look like in the Asia Pacific? Like, what do you think it needs to entail? Is it inevitably waiting for like leader follower effects with like, does Japan set the model? Does Singapore set the model? And then that sort of like acts as a tent pole to draw others into sort of regional cooperation? Like, what do you think? What's a realistic, pragmatic plan to sort of support everyone who's grappling with everything you've outlined here this afternoon?
Great question.
You want to take this given your background?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think a few areas. One is information sharing, threat intelligence sharing, and I suspect that will get better as time goes on. It's gotten better, in my experience working on cyber issues. I think, keeping, and this gets to Ambassador Hollyman's points earlier in the day about the Section 301 investigation. I think there's going to be a need for many of these countries to continue to work closely with American technology companies to safeguard their systems, and I am concerned about so I'll confess I am in many ways sympathetic to a 301 investigation on digital barriers to trade, but we should be clear-eyed about the costs, and to the extent some of those barriers are rooted in cybersecurity laws in some of these countries, that could be a barrier to cooperation. If nothing else, it might make it harder for some of these countries politically and maybe from a regulatory perspective to buy sort of best-in-breed capabilities, which the U.S. doesn't have a monopoly on companies that produce great technology and security products, but we do have a preponderance, I would argue, of capabilities. So those are all areas that kind of spring to my mind. I don't know if you guys want to add anything.
I think I mentioned some of the things earlier around threat exercises that are joint would be helpful as well. I think, just conveying the message that it's important to trust technology companies that are acting responsibly may also be helpful as well. I think, that there's a lot of interest in the private sector and helping governments achieve their cybersecurity goals. And just reinforcing that partnership as an option for governments could be helpful as well. Very good question.
No comment.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we're out of time. Done. Thank you to our panelists. We really enjoyed the discussion, and give them a hand here. Thank you so much.